Have you ever felt like you're running in circles? Not literally, but in life. No matter how far you go or what you change, you always end up right back where you started. That's how I felt when I took the job at Timberline Lodge in Oregon. 50 years old, no family to speak of, no grand career, just me bouncing between temporary gigs and temporary homes. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet job in a cozy, snow-covered lodge with picturesque views of Mount Hood. I should have known better. Places like this don't need someone to watch over them at night for no reason. There's always a catch. It wasn't until my second night on the job that I found the rules. They weren't on a sheet of paper or pinned to a bulletin board. No. They were etched into the room key itself, the one covered in ash that I'd wiped clean the night before. The faint, almost burned lettering shimmered under the dim light in the front office. Rule 1. Never leave the fireplace in the lobby unlit after 9 p.m. If it extinguishes, relight it immediately. Do not look at the shadows on the walls while doing so. Rule 2. If you hear laughter coming from room 217, do not approach. Stay behind the desk and hum any tune you can remember. The laughter will stop. Rule 3. Between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., avoid looking out any windows. If you see someone waving at you from the snow, do not wave back. They are not waving at you. Rule 4. If the phone rings and the caller whispers, "Are you warm?" do not answer. Hang up immediately. Rule 5. Once during your shift, the ash-covered room key will disappear. If it does, check all empty rooms. It will always be lying on the bed of room 104. Leave it there and lock the door. Rule 6. At 4 a.m., a faint knocking will start at the back office door. Do not open it, even if someone screams for help. The knocking will stop after 10 minutes. Rule 7. Before you leave at sunrise, check the guest logbook. If a new name has been added that you don't recognize, cross it out. Use the red pen in the bottom drawer of the desk. Failure to do this will result in the new guest joining you for your next shift. I stared at the key, my hands trembling. I didn't understand why the words had appeared now, or how I hadn't seen them the first time. But something about them felt final. Like they weren't suggestions or even warnings. They were commands. My first night started quietly enough. The Timberline Lodge was everything the job posting promised. Snow-dusted windows, wooden beams that seemed to groan with history, and an empty silence that could either soothe or unnerve you. The few guests staying there were already asleep, leaving me alone at the front desk. I had a thermos of coffee and an old radio playing faint static to keep me company. The fireplace in the lobby crackled warmly, its orange glow casting flickering shadows on the log walls. At first, I thought the job was going to be easy. Just a few hours of solitude, maybe a little boredom, and a paycheck to match. But around 9 p.m., the fire died down to embers. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees in an instant. I shivered and grabbed the iron poker to stoke the flames, but as I leaned closer, I noticed the shadows dancing across the walls. They didn't move with the flickering firelight. Instead, they twisted and bent unnaturally, stretching like ink spilling across a canvas. I froze, the poker slipping from my hand and clattering onto the stone hearth. For a moment, I swore one of the shadows turned its head to look at me. Not an illusion, not a trick of the light, a deliberate turn, like it was watching me. The air in the lobby grew heavier, pressing against my chest. Panic bubbled up as I grabbed a matchbook from the desk and relit the fire. As soon as the flames roared back to life, the shadows snapped back into place, retreating into the corners of the room. I tried to shake it off. Old buildings have quirks, I muttered to myself. But the weight in the air lingered, like an unspoken threat. I sat back down behind the desk, gripping my coffee thermos like a lifeline. It was then that I noticed the ash-covered room key sitting in the checked-out slot. Room 104. I'd cleaned it earlier that day, wiping away the soot that seemed to cling to it no matter how hard I scrubbed. But now it looked as if I hadn't touched it at all. The ash was back, covering it like a fine layer of dust from a long extinguished fire. Curiosity won over caution. I grabbed the key and ran my thumb across its surface. The words etched into it hadn't been there before, but they were clear now, as if someone had just burned them into the metal. Do not let the fire die. They see you in the dark. I dropped the key and stepped back, my heart pounding. Who's they? I whispered, my voice trembling. But no one was there to answer. The radio crackled louder, and I could have sworn I heard faint laughter hidden beneath the static. After my initial encounter with the room key and its ominous warning, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just the overactive imagination of someone adjusting to an unfamiliar job. But the lodge had other plans. It was nearing midnight, and the lodge had grown colder. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you're wearing. The fireplace burned brightly, but it didn't seem to warm the room anymore. I kept glancing at the shadows, half expecting them to move again. The radio on the desk, which had been emitting a steady stream of static, suddenly went silent. The abrupt change startled me, and I reached out to fiddle with the dial. As I turned it, the static returned, but this time, it wasn't the comforting white noise I'd grown used to. Beneath the crackle, there was a faint voice, a woman's voice, soft and distorted, as if it were coming from far away. Room 104, room 104. I froze, my fingers hovering over the dial. Who's there? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The voice didn't respond directly. Instead, the static swirled, and the words became clearer, though the distortion never faded. Keep the fire burning. They're watching. Room 104. I slammed the radio off, my pulse racing. The room was too quiet now, the silence heavy and oppressive. I turned my attention back to the desk and spotted something out of the corner of my eye. The guest book. It had been pristine earlier, but now the pages were smeared with soot. Hesitantly, I flipped it open. On the page reserved for room 104, a name was scrawled in jagged, inky handwriting. Claire Dawson. I didn't remember checking in anyone with that name. In fact, room 104 was supposed to be unoccupied tonight. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stared at the name. Beneath it, in the same jagged script, were more words. Keep the fire alive. Never leave it unattended. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the message. Was this some kind of sick prank? Had someone snuck in while I wasn't looking? I grabbed the guest book and flipped through the pages, desperate for answers. Each time I turned a page, the writing seemed to grow more chaotic, the ink bleeding across the paper as if it were alive. Don't let the lights flicker, one page read. Stay out of room 104, said another. I slammed the book shut and stepped away, my hands trembling. The fire in the lobby crackled, and for a moment, I felt a small sense of relief. At least that was still burning. But as I turned to check it, I noticed the shadows again. This time, they weren't confined to the corners of the room. They were stretching toward me, slithering across the walls like living things. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The shadows stopped just short of the desk, pooling together in an unnatural, inky mass. Then, they began to rise, forming the faint outline of a figure. Room 104, the voice from the radio whispered again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the device. It was coming from the shadow itself. My mind raced. The fire. The warning. I grabbed the poker from the hearth and stoked the flames until they roared back to life. The figure recoiled, the shadows retreating into the walls as if they'd been burned. I collapsed into the chair behind the desk, my heart pounding. The lodge was no longer just an eerie old building. It was alive, and it was watching me. The fire in the hearth continued to roar, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. I kept my eyes locked on the flames, too afraid to let them die down again. But exhaustion was creeping in. It was now past 1 a.m., and the minutes dragged as though time itself had slowed. I needed to distract myself, so I grabbed the guest book again, even though the sight of it earlier had shaken me. I thought maybe I could decipher the writing or find some clue as to what was happening. As I flipped through its soot-smeared pages, I noticed something chilling. More names had appeared. One of them, freshly written, was mine. Amber Thorne. Beneath it was a note in the same jagged, smeared ink as before. Do not leave the fire. Do not go to room 104. I slammed the book shut, panic swelling in my chest. My name wasn't there earlier, was it? I tried to recall, but my memory was clouded by fear. My gaze darted toward the clock above the fireplace. The second hand seemed to tick slower than usual, its rhythmic sound almost mocking. The tension was broken by the faint creak of a floorboard behind me. I spun around, expecting to see one of the shadows. Instead, the noise came from the hallway leading to the guest rooms. The hall was bathed in an eerie, faint yellow light from the old fixtures, but it was empty. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Old buildings creak, I told myself. It's probably just the wood settling. But then I heard it again, this time louder. A distinct sound of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, coming from somewhere down the hall. I tightened my grip on the poker from the fireplace and took a shaky step forward. My instincts screamed for me to stay by the fire, but curiosity and a primal urge to confront whatever was out there overrode my fear. The footsteps stopped just as I reached the hallway. The silence was oppressive, and the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed deafening. I called out, my voice cracking, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no answer, but then, as if in response, one of the room doors creaked open slightly. I couldn't see which room it was from where I stood, but the sight made my stomach churn. I stepped cautiously down the hall, my hand trembling as I held the poker out in front of me. The door that had opened was room 104. I froze. The guest book's warning echoed in my mind. Stay out of room 104. I wanted to turn back, to run back to the safety of the fire, but my feet moved of their own accord. I reached the door, my heart pounding in my ears, and pushed it open. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. The bed was neatly made, and the furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had used it in years. But the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Then I noticed something on the bed. A bellhop's cap, identical to the one I'd found earlier in the locker, sat neatly in the center of the comforter. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw the faint writing etched on the inside of the brim. The words weren't smeared like in the guest book. They were clear and deliberate. 1. Keep the fire burning at all times. 2. Never go to room 104. 3. If you hear footsteps, do not follow them. 4. Do not look out the windows after midnight. 5. If you answer the phone, never say your name. 6. Do not clean the ash in the hearth. 7. Leave before dawn, or you'll never leave. I read the rules again and again, my mind racing. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I'd already broken the third rule. I'd followed the footsteps. Behind me, The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the room went black. The slam of the door sent a shockwave through my chest, and the sudden blackness was absolute. My breath came in sharp gasps as I groped for the poker, which I dropped in my panic. The silence was oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the whispers. They started soft, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, closer, until they sounded as though they were just inches from my ears. Indistinct voices, layered and overlapping, murmured words I couldn't make out. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. It felt as though the voices were inside my head. My eyes darted around the pitch-black room, searching for the door. The memory of the rules burned in my mind. Never go to room 104. Yet here I was, trapped in the very place I'd been warned to avoid. I reached out, fumbling for the door handle, when something brushed against my arm. It wasn't the cold metal of the handle or the smooth wood of the door. It was soft, almost velvety, fabric. My heart sank as I realized what it was. The bellhop's cap. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, a deep, guttural exhale. It wasn't mine. I froze, my back pressed against the door, as the sound grew louder. It was rhythmic, raspy, like someone, or something, was breathing heavily right behind me. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, barely above a whisper. I didn't expect an answer, but I got one. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was low and gravelly, distinctly male, and it sent ice through my veins. I spun around, expecting to see someone, or something, in the room with me. But it was still too dark to see anything. My fingers found the matches in my pocket, and with trembling hands, I struck one. The tiny flame illuminated the room just enough to reveal the bed, the dresser, and the bellhop's cap lying on the floor. And then I saw him. He stood in the corner, barely illuminated by the flickering match. He was dressed in a tattered bellhop uniform, his face pale and hollow, like a wax figure left out in the sun. His eyes, if you could call them that, were sunken pits of darkness. He tilted his head, as if studying me, and took a step forward. "Why did you follow the footsteps?" he asked, his voice echoing unnaturally. I didn't know," I stammered, backing away until I hit the dresser. The match burned down to my fingers, and I dropped it with a hiss of pain. The room plunged into darkness again. "You broke the rule," the voice said, closer now. I could feel his presence, the cold radiating from him like a winter storm. "They'll come for you now." "Who? Who's coming?" My voice cracked, panic taking hold. "The ones who never left," he replied, his voice almost a whisper now. "The ones who burned." Suddenly, the room was filled with light. Not the warm glow of a flame, but a harsh, flickering orange light, as though the walls themselves had caught fire. I shielded my eyes, and when I looked again, the bellhop was gone. But I wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the walls, their forms charred and smoldering. They moved slowly, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. Their eyes, empty and hollow, locked onto me, and I knew without a doubt that they were the ones he had warned me about. Desperation kicked in. I lunged for the door, twisting the handle with all my strength. It didn't budge. The figures drew closer, their charred hands reaching for me. I screamed, pounding on the door, until suddenly it flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The hallway was as I'd left it, dimly lit and eerily quiet. But the door to room 104 was now shut tight, as if nothing had happened. My hands shook as I scrambled to my feet, the rules flashing through my mind. I'd broken one rule. I couldn't afford to break another. I staggered back to the lobby, my legs trembling beneath me. The door to room 104 now seemed innocuous, its brass numbers gleaming faintly in the dim light. But I knew better. My chest heaved as I collapsed into the chair behind the reception desk, staring at the floor as my mind raced. The whispers still echoed faintly in my ears, a cruel reminder of what I had just witnessed. I reached for the room key in my pocket, pulling it out to inspect it under the desk lamp. The ash had worn off slightly, revealing faint markings on its surface. Squinting, I traced my finger along the lines, realizing they weren't scratches or damage. They were words. Scratched into the metal in jagged, uneven script were the words, "They're watching." My stomach dropped. I scanned the lobby, half expecting to see the charred figures from before materializing out of the walls. But the room was empty. The front doors stood ajar, swaying gently in the mountain breeze. I could hear the faint howl of the wind outside, carrying with it a deep, mournful moan that sounded disturbingly human. I told myself I needed to leave, that whatever this job was, it wasn't worth staying another second. Yet my feet felt rooted to the ground. The rules I had found earlier burned in my mind, especially the final one. Do not leave the lodge before dawn. Was it a trick? Some cruel joke by the previous staff? Or was it something else entirely? As if on cue, the radio behind the desk crackled to life, breaking the silence. Static hissed from the speakers, but beneath it, I could hear faint voices. My fingers hovered over the power knob, but I didn't dare turn it off. The static began to clear, replaced by a distant, haunting voice. She broke the rule. She's next. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair in the process. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty lobby. The radio went silent for a moment, before another voice cut through. This one was softer, almost pleading. "Help us!" I froze. It wasn't just one voice. There were many. Male, female, young, old. They overlapped, creating an eerie symphony of despair. They spoke in fragments, their words jumbled and out of sync. Fire, trapped, the bellhop. She's still here. She'll take your voice. The last phrase hit me like a punch to the gut. My voice? What did that mean? Suddenly, the lights in the lobby flickered, plunging the room into semi-darkness. The faint glow of the lamp on the desk was the only source of light now. The air grew heavier, colder, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly toward me. It was her, the woman from the painting above the fireplace. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her dress hung in tatters around her skeletal frame. She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head as though studying me. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice hollow and distant. I'm just working the night shift," I stammered, clutching the desk for support. "No one works here," she replied, her lips curling into a chilling smile. "Not for long." Before I could respond, the lights flickered again, and she was gone. The only trace of her presence was the lingering scent of smoke and charred wood. I turned my attention back to the desk, searching frantically for the rules. I had to remind myself of what I needed to do, or avoid. Pulling the sheet from the drawer, I scanned the list, my eyes landing on the next critical point. Do not respond to voices after 2 a.m. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 1:57 a.m. I kept my eyes glued to the clock. The seconds seemed to crawl as the hands inched toward 2 a.m. My heart pounded in my chest as I recited the rule over and over in my head. Do not respond to voices after 2 a.m. But the whispers were growing louder. It started softly at first, faint murmurs, like a radio tuned just out of frequency. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out. The voices weren't coming from the lobby anymore. They were coming from everywhere. The walls, the floors, the air itself. The clock struck 2 a.m., and the voices sharpened into clarity. "Amber, can you hear us?" A soft voice called, echoing like it came from underwater. It was a woman's voice, trembling with fear. I clenched my jaw and stayed silent, squeezing the paper with the rules so tightly in my hand that it crumpled. "Please, we're trapped. You can save us," another voice whispered. This one was male, deep and filled with anguish. I didn't move, didn't breathe. But the voices persisted, growing more insistent. "You don't belong here. They'll take you too. Amber, don't leave us like this." My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like I was being suffocated by their words. I fought the urge to speak, even as tears stung my eyes. Whoever, or whatever they weren't human anymore. They couldn't be. The radio crackled to life again, this time with a low, droning hum. The voices overlapped, their pleas now mixed with chilling laughter. I backed away from the desk, my legs trembling. "Amber, help us. Please," one voice cried. "Stay," another growled, the tone guttural and inhuman. I stumbled toward the front door, desperate to escape, but as I reached for the handle, the room went ice cold. A sharp gust of wind blew through the lobby, extinguishing the lamp and plunging me into darkness. And then, I saw them. Figures began to materialize in the dim glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows. They looked like shadows at first, flickering and shifting. But as they drew closer, their forms became clearer. There were at least a dozen of them, men, women, even children, each one bearing burns and scars from the fire that had consumed this place. Their eyes glowed faintly, pinpoints of pale light in their hollow sockets. "Why didn't you help us?" one of them hissed, their voice a distorted echo. I couldn't answer. My throat felt like it had closed up completely. "You'll join us soon," another said, stepping forward. Their face was half melted, the skin hanging like wax. I backed away, my legs weak and shaking. The door was only a few feet away, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind raced, trying to remember the next rule. Do not leave the lodge before 6 a.m. It was barely past 2 a.m. The figures surrounded me, their whispers overlapping into a cacophony of despair. I pressed my back against the door, clutching the key in my hand like a talisman. The cold metal dug into my palm, grounding me. Suddenly, the woman from the painting appeared again, stepping through the shadows like she was gliding. Her dress swayed around her emaciated frame, and her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "You should have listened," she said softly, her voice dripping with malice. "But it's too late now." I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. But when I opened them, the figures were gone. The room was silent again, save for the faint hum of the radio. The clock read 2:15. By 3 a.m., I wasn't sure if I was awake or trapped in some surreal nightmare. The lodge seemed alive, shifting and creaking with every step I took. The walls felt like they were leaning inward, closing me in. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of ash and burnt wood. My every breath felt labored. I clutched the key tightly in my hand, its cold surface grounding me in the madness. The rules echoed in my mind like a mantra. Stay in the lobby. Do not open room 212. Do not respond to voices. They were all I had now, a fragile lifeline in a sea of terror. But then the whispers returned, louder and more sinister. This time they weren't pleading. They were laughing. "Amber," a voice crooned, its tone mocking. "You can't escape." I froze. The voice wasn't just around me, it was inside my head. It felt like it was seeping into my thoughts, weaving itself into the fabric of my mind. I gritted my teeth and pressed my hands against my temples, trying to block it out. The radio on the front desk crackled to life, its static a harsh, grating sound. Then, a voice I hadn't heard before spoke. "Amber," it said, cold and detached. "Room 212 is waiting for you." My heart dropped into my stomach. The rule forbidding entry into room 212 had been etched into my brain since the moment I'd read the key's inscription. It was the one rule that felt unbreakable, sacred. But now, it was calling to me. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "I'm not going in there." But the lodge had other plans. The floorboards beneath me groaned as if something heavy was moving beneath them. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The radio continued to hum, its static rising and falling like a heartbeat. And then, the door to room 212 creaked open. I stared at the door from the lobby, my breath hitching in my throat. It stood ajar, just enough for me to see the pitch-black void beyond. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, distorting the space and making it seem unreal. I didn't want to go. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put, to follow the rules. But my legs moved on their own, drawn to the doorway like a moth to a flame. As I approached, the whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. They were chanting now, words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, the key still clutched in my palm. When I stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder, so cold that my breath fogged in front of me. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On it sat an old, charred ledger, its pages blackened and crumbling. The whispers quieted, replaced by an oppressive silence. I opened the ledger with shaking hands. My eyes scanned the faded ink, each name meticulously written in spidery handwriting. And then, I saw it. My name. Amber Hayes. Beside it, the word caretaker was written in bold red letters. A wave of nausea hit me. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor. The ledger fell from my hands, landing with a dull thud. I couldn't tear my eyes away from my name, etched there, as though I had been chosen long before I ever arrived at the lodge. "Welcome," the woman's voice from the painting whispered, her tone dripping with malice. "You're one of us now." The door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at my name in that cursed ledger. It could have been minutes or hours. Time no longer had meaning in the suffocating grip of the lodge. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to accept my fate. The air in the room grew warmer. The icy chill was replaced by a slow, creeping heat, and the faint smell of ash returned, stronger now. The walls began to shimmer, like waves of heat rolling off pavement in the dead of summer. I stumbled to my feet, clutching the key like a lifeline. "Let me out," I whispered, though there was no one to hear me. The walls didn't respond. Instead, they started to burn. Flames licked up from the corners of the room, their orange and red tongues hungry and alive. They spread with unnatural speed, consuming the walls and floor but leaving the air clear of smoke. The fire wasn't just hot, it was suffocating, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. My lungs screamed for air, but the heat stole every breath. And then, I saw them. Figures emerged from the flames, their bodies charred and skeletal, their hollow eyes glowing like embers. They walked slowly, deliberately, their movements stiff and unnatural. Their faces were twisted into grotesque expressions of pain and anger, and their voices came in guttural, raspy whispers. "Amber," one of them rasped, its voice echoing with 1,000 others. "You can't leave." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "No," I gasped. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." But it was. The flames closed in around me, the heat unbearable now. My skin felt like it was boiling, but when I looked down, I was untouched. The fire wasn't meant to destroy me. It was meant to claim me. The figures surrounded me, their skeletal hands reaching out. One of them held the ledger, its blackened pages open to my name. The others chanted in a language I couldn't understand, their voices blending into a haunting, rhythmic dirge. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fire. When I woke, I was back at the front desk. The key was in my hand, its surface cool to the touch. The ledger was gone, as were the flames and the figures. Everything was as it had been when I first arrived. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then, the phone rang. I stared at it, my heart sinking. The rules came rushing back to me, as clear as if they were etched into my mind. Answer every call. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not question the voices. The phone rang again, louder this time, insistent. I reached for it with trembling hands and pressed it to my ear. "You're one of us now," the voice on the other end said, a cruel smile in its tone. "Welcome to the lodge." And then, the line went dead. The Timberline Lodge still stands, its towering silhouette a dark stain against the Oregon mountains. If you ever find yourself passing through, you might see a light in the front window, a shadow moving behind the desk. But don't stop. The lodge has enough caretakers. It doesn't need another.